Get ready for your mind to be blown. Marie Antoinette probably never uttered, "Let them eat cake." Those fierce Vikings didn't actually charge into battle with horned helmets, and the discoverer of America, Christopher Columbus, wasn't even the first European to land there. History class might have skipped a few details, and we're here to spill the tea, the historically accurate tea, that is. Prepare for some major myth-busting. Number 15. Ninjas didn't actually sneak around in all-black PAs. Okay, picture a Godiva. They're decked out, head to toe, in sleek black right, moving like a shadow, totally invisible against the night sky. It's the classic image we've seen in movies and pop culture forever. This super stealthy black outfit is practically the uniform. We imagine them scaling walls and disappearing into the darkness, their black garb making them one with the night. This portrayal is so common, it's hard to think of ninjas any other way. But hold on to your throwing stars, because that mental image might need a serious reboot. While ninjas, or shinobi, as they were properly known in feudal Japan, were masters of espionage, sabotage, and covert operations, the whole all-black ensemble isn't quite historically accurate. Think about it. Pure black can actually stand out pretty starkly on a moonlit night or against varied backgrounds. Creates a silhouette, making the wearer an easier target rather than a harder one to spot. The night is rarely pure black. It's full of shades of gray, blue, and brown. So, what did these legendary spies actually wear? Evidence suggests they were more likely to don dark, muted colors like navy blue, dark gray, or even deep browns. These shades would blend much better into the shadows and natural environments than a solid black. Even more often, ninjas opted for the ultimate camouflage: disguise. They'd dress as farmers, monks, merchants, or traveling performers. Blending in with everyday people was a far more effective way to gather information or get close to a target than sticking out like a sore thumb in a distinct ninja suit. Their goal was to be unnoticed, and sometimes the best way to be unnoticed is to look perfectly ordinary. Where did the black pajama idea come from then? It's largely believed to have originated from Japanese kabuki theater. In kabuki, stagehands known as kuroko dress entirely in black. This convention signals to the audience that the kuroko are supposed to be invisible, not part of the scene, as they move props or assist actors. When ninjas were portrayed on stage, they were often dressed in the same black attire to visually represent their stealth and unseen presence. This theatrical convention just kind of stuck and became the go-to image for ninjas in popular imagination. So, the iconic look is more stagecraft than battlefield, stealth wear, sneaky right. It's a testament to how powerful visual storytelling can be, even if it bends the historical truth a little. Number 14. Medieval people did not widely believe the earth was flat. One of the most enduring myths about the Middle Ages is that everyone, from peasants to kings, believed the earth was a flat disk. We often hear that Christopher Columbus was a brave visionary who sailed west to prove the world was round, defying the supposedly ignorant flat-earthers of his time. This narrative paints a picture of a benighted medieval period, only to be enlightened by the Renaissance and Age of Discovery. However, this popular image is largely a historical fabrication. Truth is, educated people in Europe during the Middle Ages, and indeed for centuries before, knew that the earth was a sphere. This knowledge wasn't some obscure secret. It dated back to ancient Greek philosophers like Pythagoras in the 6th century BC, and was empirically confirmed by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. Thinkers like Plato also wrote about a spherical earth. This understanding was carried forward by Roman scholars and subsequently by medieval intellectuals. Figures like St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and Roger Bacon all accepted a spherical Earth. Scholars even calculated its circumference with reasonable accuracy. So, if everyone knew the Earth was round, what was Columbus's big debate about? It wasn't about the Earth's shape, but about its size and the feasibility of reaching the East Indies by sailing west. Columbus seriously underestimated the Earth's circumference and, consequently, the distance of the westward voyage to Asia. His contemporary critics, who also believed the Earth was round, argued that his calculations were wrong and that the ocean was far too vast to cross with the ships and supplies available at the time. They were, in fact, correct about the distance. Columbus just got lucky by bumping into the Americas, a landmass no one in Europe knew was there. The myth of medieval flat earthim was largely popularized in the 19th century by writers like Washington Irving, in his fictionalized biography of Columbus, and Antoine Jean Latron. They used it to create a narrative of conflict between superstitious religion and enlightened science, portraying Columbus as a hero of reason. This portrayal served certain ideological purposes at the time, but has unfortunately distorted our understanding of medieval knowledge. So the next time you hear about Columbus proving the Earth was round, remember that the real debate was a bit more nuanced, and medieval folks were generally savvier than we give them credit for. Number 13. Paul Revere didn't shout, "The British are coming. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's famous 1861 poem cemented Paul Revere as the lone heroic figure galloping through the Massachusetts countryside, dramatically shouting, "The British are coming," to awaken the colonial minutemen. It's a powerful image of American revolutionary fervor. But like many legendary tales, the reality of Paul Revere's ride on the night of April 18, 1775 was a bit different, and arguably even more interesting because it involved a network of dedicated individuals. Firstly, Revere wasn't the only rider that night. He was part of a well-organized warning system. William Dawes was dispatched on a different route, and later they were joined by Samuel Prescott. Their mission wasn't a general indiscriminate alarm, but a specific warning to Samuel Adams and John Hancock, key revolutionary leaders who were staying in Lexington, that British troops were marching to arrest them and seize military supplies stored in Concord. What about that famous phrase, "The British are coming"? It's highly unlikely Revere or any other rider would have shouted that. Why? Because in 1775, the colonists still considered themselves British subjects. They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen. Shouting, "The British are coming," would have been confusing and nonsensical. Like shouting, "We are coming." More probable warnings would have been something like, "The regulars are coming out," or "The King's men are on the march." This was specific language to alert fellow colonists that the British Army soldiers, distinct from the local populace, were on the move. Furthermore, the ride was conducted with as much stealth as possible, especially in the early stages when Revere had to slip past British patrols. Loudly shouting would have quickly alerted the British to his presence and compromised the mission. The warnings were delivered more discreetly, often by knocking on doors of known Patriot sympathizers and leaders. While Revere was indeed captured by a British patrol later that night, though Prescott managed to escape and complete the warning to Concord, his role was crucial. Longfellow's poem, written decades later to foster national unity during a divisive period leading up to the Civil War, took artistic liberties, simplifying the story and creating a singular American icon. True story highlights the coordinated effort and bravery of many individuals, not just one. Number 12. Lady Godiva probably didn't ride stark naked through Coventry. Tale of Lady Godiva is a romantic and rather racy one. A noblewoman so moved by the plight of her people, who were suffering under her husband Leofric's oppressive taxes, that she agreed to his challenge. He supposedly said he'd lower the taxes if she rode naked through the marketplace of Coventry. She did her modesty shielded only by her long flowing hair, and the grateful townsfolk all stayed indoors, except for one curious fellow named Tom, who peeked and was struck blind, hence Peeping Tom. It's a fantastic story, and Lady Godiva, or Godiva in Old English, was a real historical figure in 11th century England. She and her husband, Leofric, Earl of Mercia, were indeed known for their piety and generous endowments to religious houses, including a Benedictine monastery in Coventry. There's historical evidence of her existence and her landholdings. However, the famous naked ride part of the story is on much shakier ground. The earliest accounts of this event don't appear until about 100 to 200 years after Lady Godiva's death. The first known written version, by Roger of Wendover in the 13th century, describes the ride. As the story was retold over centuries, it became more embellished. For instance, the element of her long hair conveniently covering her was a later addition, making the tale a bit more palatable. Peeping Tom character didn't show up in the narrative until the 16th or 17th century, adding a moralistic, cautionary element to the legend. What might be closer to the truth? Some historians suggest that if there was any public act of penance or demonstration by Godiva, it might have involved her riding through the town stripped of her finery, or in a simple shift, which would have been a significant symbolic gesture for a woman of her high status. The idea of complete nudity might be a later exaggeration to make the story more dramatic and memorable. While the image of a courageous, compassionate noblewoman defying her husband for her people is inspiring, the literal unclad gallop through Coventry marketplace is more likely a product of folklore and legend than a documented historical fact. She was undoubtedly a significant historical figure, but perhaps not in the exact way the popular legend portrays her. Number 11. The Great Wall of China isn't actually visible from space with the naked eye. This is a classic, amazing fact that many of us learned it as kids. The Great Wall of China is so massive, so monumental, that it's the only man-made structure visible from the moon with the naked eye. It's a statement that really captures the immense scale of this ancient wonder and human endeavor. But, unfortunately, this widely believed fact is just not true. Let's start with the moon part. Astronauts who have walked on the moon, including Neil Armstrong and Jim Lovell, have all confirmed that you cannot see the Great Wall or any other specific man-made structures from the lunar surface. From that distance, the Earth appears as a sphere of clouds, oceans, and continents, but individual human constructions are far too small to be resolved by the naked eye. Think about it. The wall, while incredibly long, is relatively narrow, at most about 30 feet wide. Trying to see that from an average distance of 238,855 miles away is like trying to see a single human hair from 2 miles away. What about from lower Earth orbit, where space shuttles and the International Space Station ISS fly? Even from this much closer vantage point, a few hundred miles up, seeing the Great Wall is exceptionally difficult and requires perfect conditions. Some astronauts have reported being able to spot it, but usually with the aid of binoculars or telephoto lenses, and only if they know exactly where to look and if the lighting and atmospheric conditions are just right. Even then, it appears as a very fine, indistinct line and can be easily confused with other features like rivers or mountain ranges. Many other man-made objects, such as highways, airports, and large dams, are actually more easily visible from low Earth orbit than the Great Wall because of their width or contrast with the surrounding environment. So where did this persistent myth come from? It seems to have origins predating the space age, perhaps from early 20th century writings that speculated about what might be visible from great heights or even from the moon. The idea gained more traction in the 1930s. Once the space race began, the visible from the moon claim became a popular piece of trivia, repeated so often that it became accepted as truth. While the Great Wall of China is undeniably an astonishing feat of engineering and a testament to human perseverance, its visibility from space has been greatly exaggerated. It doesn't need to be seen from the moon to be awe-inspiring. Number 10. Napoleon Bonaparte was not actually super short. Sorry, meme lords. Napoleon Bonaparte, the military genius, the Emperor of the French, and the really, really short guy. The idea of Napoleon being vertically challenged is so ingrained in our culture. The Napoleon complex used to describe shorter people who are supposedly overly aggressive or domineering to compensate for their height. We picture him barely peeking over podiums, a tiny terror on the European stage. This image has fueled countless jokes and caricatures over the centuries. But here's a historical plot twist that might make you stand a little taller. Napoleon wasn't actually that short, especially by the standards of his time. So, how tall was he? Records, including an autopsy report conducted by his personal physician Francois Carlo Antomarchi after his death in 1821, list his height at around 5 French feet and 2 inches, 5 pieds 2 pouces. Now here's where things get tricky and the misunderstanding begins. A French foot, pied de rail, back then was longer than a British imperial foot. Specifically, the French inch was about 2.71 centimeters, while the British inch was about 2.54 centimeters. When you convert that French measurement of 5 pies, 2 pouces, to modern international or British imperial units, it comes out to roughly 5 feet 6 inches or 5 feet 7 inches, about 1.68 to 1.7 meters. Consider this. The average height for a Frenchman in the early 19th century was around 5 feet 5 inches, approximately 1.65 meters. So, Napoleon was actually slightly taller than the average Joe in his own country. He definitely wasn't a giant, but he certainly wasn't the pocket-sized tyrant he's often made out to be. Why the persistent myth, then? Couple of key factors are at play. Firstly, there's that measurement muddle. British propagandists, who were Napoleon's bitter enemies for much of his reign, happily seized on the lower number 5'2", without bothering to clarify, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the French versus British inch difference. It made for great caricature material to portray their formidable foe as a comically small man. Think about those political cartoons from the era. They loved to exaggerate his supposed shortness, to diminish his stature and power. Secondly, Napoleon often surrounded himself with his elite imperial guard. These soldiers were handpicked for their bravery and experience, but also for their height. They were required to be taller than average. Standing next to these imposing grenadier-type soldiers would naturally make anyone of average height look shorter by comparison. His nickname, Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, wasn't initially about his physical height, but was an affectionate term given by his troops early in his career, highlighting his camaraderie and willingness to share their hardships. It was later twisted by his enemies. So it was a perfect storm of differing measurement systems, enemy propaganda, and visual context that effectively shrunk Napoleon in the popular imagination. The image of a diminutive dictator was far more amusing and less threatening for his opponents than the reality of an average-height, highly capable leader who conquered much of Europe. Number 9. George Washington didn't actually chop down a cherry tree and say, "I cannot tell a lie." One of the most beloved and enduring stories about George Washington, the first president of the United States, is the tale of the cherry tree. As the story goes, a young George, perhaps 6 years old, received a hatchet as a gift. Eager to try it out, he impulsively chopped down his father's favorite cherry tree. When confronted by his angry father, young George bravely confessed, "I cannot tell a lie, Pa. You know I cannot tell a lie. I did cut it with my hatchet." His father, so impressed by his son's honesty, supposedly declared that his son's truthfulness was worth more than 1,000 trees. This anecdote has been used for generations to illustrate Washington's impeccable honesty and moral character, presenting him as a paragon of virtue from a very young age. It's a simple, powerful story that teaches a clear lesson about the importance of telling the truth. It has appeared in children's books and school lessons for centuries. However, as charming as this story is, there's a very good reason why historians don't cite it as actual biographical fact. It was completely invented. The cherry tree tale first appeared in the 5th edition of a biography titled The Life of George Washington, written by Mason Locke Weems, better known as Parson Weems. This edition was published in 1806, 7 years after Washington's death. Weems was an itinerant bookseller and minister who aimed to create an inspiring, morally uplifting portrayal of Washington for the young American nation. He wasn't overly concerned with strict historical accuracy if a good story could serve a virtuous purpose. Weems himself admitted in later editions that he had heard the story from an aged lady who was supposedly a distant relative of the Washington family. But there's no corroborating evidence whatsoever to support this claim or the story itself. No earlier biographies or contemporary accounts of Washington's life mention anything about a cherry tree incident. Historians generally agree that Weems fabricated it along with other apocryphal stories about Washington to make his biography more popular and to provide moral instruction to his readers. He wanted to present Washington not just as a great leader, but as a flawless moral exemplar, a figure for young Americans to emulate. While George Washington was indeed a man of strong character and integrity, the specific story of the cherry tree and the famous line, "I cannot tell a lie," is pure legend, a piece of early American folklore designed to build a national hero. Number 8. Witches weren't burned at the stake in the Salem witch trials. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 in colonial Massachusetts are a dark and infamous chapter in American history. Common image associated with these trials is one of mass hysteria leading to accused witches being burned at the stake in a fiery spectacle. This depiction is prevalent in popular culture, from movies to books, often showing bonfires and screaming victims. However, while the Salem witch trials were indeed a tragic and terrifying event resulting in the deaths of innocent people, the method of execution commonly portrayed is incorrect for the American colonial context. In Salem, and indeed in the English colonies in general, the legal punishment for witchcraft as prescribed by English law at the time was hanging, not burning. Burning at the stake for witchcraft was a practice more common in continental Europe, particularly during the height of the European witch hunts, which were often conducted by ecclesiastical or inquisitorial courts. The English legal system, upon which colonial American law was based, specified different penalties. During the Salem witch trials, 19 people, 14 women and 5 men, were convicted of witchcraft and executed. All 19 of them were hanged on Gallows Hill. Another man, Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, was pressed to death with heavy stones, a practice called peine forte et dure, for refusing to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty in court. Several other accused individuals died in prison while awaiting trial due to the harsh conditions, but no one was burned at the stake in Salem. Causes of the Salem witch trials were complex and are still debated by historians. Commentators likely included genuine belief in witchcraft, which was widespread at the time, social and economic tensions within the Salem village community, disputes over land and church leadership, anxieties related to recent frontier wars with Native Americans, and possibly even Visiodor fires, like ergot poisoning, a fungus that can grow on rye and cause hallucinations and convulsions. It wasn't simply mass hysteria in a vacuum, but a confluence of specific fears, beliefs, and local conflicts that spiraled out of control within a Puritan society that took the threat of the devil and his minions very seriously. Understanding the correct method of execution helps to accurately place the Salem events within their specific legal and cultural framework, distinct from some of the European witch hunting traditions. Number 7. Pilgrims didn't exclusively wear black and white with buckled hats. When we think of the Pilgrims, those early English settlers who arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1620, a very specific image often comes to mind. Somber-faced men and women dressed entirely in black and white clothing, with the men sporting tall, buckled hats, and the women wearing plain bonnets. This is the quintessential Thanksgiving pageant costume, the image on greeting cards, and the way they are often depicted in historical illustrations. But this stern, monochrome image of the Pilgrims is more of a 19th century invention than an accurate reflection of 17th century attire. While the Pilgrims were Puritans who valued piety and simplicity, their clothing choices were not as drab or uniform as popular culture suggests. Historical records, including wills, inventories of estates, and letters from the period, indicate that the Pilgrims, like other English people of their time, wore a variety of colors. Black dye was expensive and often reserved for more formal or Sunday wear, or for those of higher status. Everyday clothing would have included russets, reddish browns, greens, yellows, blues, and grays, colors made from natural dyes available at the time. They wore what was practical and common for people of their social standing in England. And what about those iconic buckles? While buckles did exist in the 17th century, they were not as ubiquitously worn on hats and shoes by pilgrims as often depicted. Buckles were generally more expensive and might have been a sign of wealth or status. More commonly, people used leather laces or ribbons to fasten their shoes and clothing. The exaggerated, large buckles on hats and shoes became a popular visual shorthand for pilgrim much later, likely in the 19th century, when artists and illustrators began to romanticize and visually codify the image of these early settlers. The tall steeple-crowned hat, capotine, was indeed a style worn during that period, but not exclusively by pilgrims, and not always with a big silver buckle on it. The popular image of the all-black and white, buckled-up pilgrim really took hold in the Victorian era, when Thanksgiving became a national holiday, and there was a surge of interest in colonial history. Artists and writers of that time tended to portray the Pilgrims in a way that emphasized their perceived solemnity and religious devotion, and the stark black and white attire fit this narrative. So, while the Pilgrims were certainly devout and valued modesty, their actual wardrobe was likely more colorful and varied than the popular Thanksgiving costume would have us believe. They were real people living in a particular historical context, not characters in a deliberately austere play. Number 6. Albert Einstein did not fail math as a child. This is a very popular and often comforting myth. Albert Einstein, the genius who revolutionized physics, struggled with mathematics in his early school days and even failed the math exam. It's a story that gives hope to students everywhere who find math challenging, suggesting that early academic struggles don't preclude future greatness. The implication is, if Einstein failed math, then it's okay if I'm not great at it either. However, this tale is quite simply false. Albert Einstein was, in fact, a prodigious talent in mathematics and physics from a very young age. He was consistently at the top of his class in these subjects. By the time he was 12 years old, he had taught himself Euclidean geometry from a textbook. By age 15, he had already mastered differential and integral calculus, subjects that many students don't encounter until college. His academic records from his school days in Germany and Switzerland clearly show excellent grades in mathematics and science. So where did this persistent myth come from? There are a few possible sources of confusion. One theory is that it arose from a change in the grading system at the school Einstein attended in Switzerland, the Luitpold Gymnasium, later Albert Einstein Gymnasium. For a period, the numbers used for grades were reversed, with 6 becoming the highest mark and 1 the lowest, whereas previously it might have been the other way around. Someone looking at his transcript without knowing about this change might misinterpret a 1 as a failing grade, when it was actually top marks. Another possible source for the myth comes from Einstein himself, who later in life mentioned that he found the rigid, rote learning style of his German schooling to be stifling and uninspiring, particularly in subjects outside of math and physics. He famously disliked authority and the regimented approach to education. He did fail an entrance exam to the prestigious Swiss Federal Polytechnic School, ETH Zurich, in 1895 when he was only 16, 2 years younger than the typical applicant. However, he passed the mathematics and science sections of that exam with flying colors. It was the non-science subjects, like French language, where he fell short. He then attended a cantonal school in Aarau, Switzerland, to prepare for a year, and passed the ETH entrance exam easily the following year. Einstein himself addressed the myth later in life. When shown a newspaper headline that read, "Greatest living mathematician failed in mathematics," he reportedly laughed and said, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." So, while it's a nice thought that even Einstein had his academic weak spots, the idea that he failed math is simply not supported by historical evidence. He was a mathematical whiz kid from early on. Number 5. Cleopatra's power wasn't primarily her seductive beauty. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt, is one of history's most iconic female rulers. The popular image, heavily influenced by Shakespeare, Hollywood movies, and ancient Roman propaganda, is of an irresistible femme fatale who used her stunning physical beauty to seduce powerful Roman leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, thereby manipulating them to her political advantage. Her name has become almost synonymous with exotic, allure, and dangerous charm. But was Cleopatra's primary weapon her drop-dead gorgeous looks? Historical evidence suggests that while she was undoubtedly captivating, her real power lay in her intellect, charisma, political astuteness, and education. Contemporary descriptions and depictions of Cleopatra, such as those on coins minted during her reign, don't portray her as a conventional beauty by modern or even classical standards. These coins often show her with a prominent nose, a somewhat pointed chin, and a strong jawline, features that suggest a commanding presence rather than delicate prettiness. Ancient writers like Plutarch, who wrote biographies of Caesar and Antony, described Cleopatra's appeal in terms of her intelligence, her charm, and the allure of her conversation. Plutarch wrote that her beauty was not in itself so altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. Instead, he emphasized, the contact of her presence, if you lived with her, was irresistible. The attraction of her person joining with the charm of her conversation and the character that attended all she said or did was something bewitching. He also highlighted her melodious voice and her ability to speak multiple languages fluently, reportedly 9, including Egyptian, which was rare for the Ptolemaic rulers who were of Greek descent. This linguistic skill allowed her to communicate directly with foreign dignitaries and her own diverse subjects, without always relying on translators. Cleopatra was a highly educated ruler, well-versed in mathematics, philosophy, oratory, and astronomy. She was a shrewd political strategist who skillfully navigated the complex and dangerous world of Roman politics to protect Egypt's independence for as long as possible. She managed Egypt's economy, commanded naval fleets, and made alliances. The Romans, particularly Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, who defeated Antony and Cleopatra, had a vested interest in portraying her negatively as a decadent, manipulative foreign seductress who corrupted noble Roman men. This propaganda helped justify his war against Antony and legitimize his own rise to power. While she certainly used her relationships with Caesar and Antony to further Egypt's interests, these were likely complex alliances based on mutual political and strategic benefit as much as any personal attraction. Her lasting legacy is that of a capable and intelligent ruler, not just a beautiful face. Number 4. Christopher Columbus did not discover America. The story traditionally taught in many schools is that, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, discovered America. This narrative often positions him as a brave explorer who ventured into the unknown and brought a new world to the attention of Europeans, ushering in an age of exploration and colonization. He is celebrated with holidays and statues in many parts of the Americas. However, the claim that Columbus discovered America is problematic and inaccurate on several fundamental levels. Firstly, and most importantly, the continents of North and South America were already inhabited by millions of indigenous peoples when Columbus arrived. These diverse nations and cultures had been living there for thousands of years with their own complex societies, languages, and traditions. You cannot discover a place where people are already living and have established civilizations. For these indigenous populations, Columbus's arrival was not a discovery, but an invasion that marked the beginning of centuries of colonization, displacement, disease, and violence. Secondly, even if we limit the scope to European arrival, Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas. Archaeological and historical evidence clearly shows that Norse Vikings, led by figures like Leif Erikson, had established settlements in North America, specifically in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, at L'Anse aux Meadows, around 1000 AD, nearly 500 years before Columbus's first voyage. While these Norse settlements were not permanent and did not lead to widespread European colonization at the time, they do represent earlier European contact with the Americas. What Columbus's voyages did accomplish was to initiate sustained and widespread contact between Europe and the Americas, leading to the period of European exploration, conquest, and colonization that profoundly reshaped the world. His voyages opened up the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. While this exchange had some positive aspects, it also brought devastating consequences for the indigenous populations of the Americas, primarily through the introduction of European diseases to which they had no immunity, as well as through warfare and enslavement. So, while Columbus's voyages were undeniably historically significant for their global impact, characterizing him as the discoverer of America erases the presence and history of indigenous peoples and overlooks earlier European explorers. Number 3. Vikings didn't actually wear horned helmets. Picture a Viking warrior. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Chances are it's a fierce, bearded man wearing a helmet adorned with a pair of prominent horns, ready to charge into battle. This image of the horned Viking helmet is incredibly pervasive in popular culture, in movies, comic books, cartoons, and even as sports team mascots. Come the defining symbol of Viking ferocity. But here's a historical spoiler. There is virtually no archaeological or historical evidence to support the idea that Viking warriors actually wore horned helmets in battle. Extensive archaeological excavations of Viking burial sites, settlements, and battlefields across Scandinavia and other parts of Europe have unearthed numerous Viking artifacts, including weapons, armor, and helmets. The Viking helmets that have been discovered, like the famous Geirmundur helmet found in Norway, are typically simple, practical affairs, usually made of iron or leather, often dome-shaped or conical, sometimes with a spectacle-like guard around the eyes and nose, but notably lacking any horns. Think about it from a practical combat perspective. Horns on a helmet would be incredibly unwieldy and disadvantageous in a fight. They could easily get caught on things, be grabbed by an opponent, or unbalance the wearer. They would offer no real protection and would actually make the helmet less effective as a piece of defensive gear. Real Viking warriors were pragmatic and would have prioritized functional, effective equipment. So, where did this iconic but inaccurate image of the horned helmet come from? The popularization of horned Viking helmets is largely attributed to the 19th century, specifically to a costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler. In the 1870s, Doppler designed the costumes for a production of Richard Wagner's opera cycle Der Ring des Nibelungen, The Ring of the Nibelungen, which draws on Norse mythology. Doppler gave his Viking characters helmets with dramatic horns, likely to enhance their fierce and pagan appearance on stage. This imagery proved incredibly striking and memorable, and it quickly caught on in popular imagination, becoming the standard representation of Vikings. There are some pre-Viking era, Bronze Age, depictions and artifacts from Scandinavia that show figures with horned headdresses, likely for ceremonial or ritual purposes. But these predate the Viking Age by centuries and were not battle gear. So, while the horned helmet makes for a cool and fearsome look, it's more a product of 19th century romanticism and operatic fantasy than historical Viking reality. Number 2. Nero didn't fiddle while Rome burned. Nero fiddled while Rome burned. This phrase has become a powerful idiom used to describe someone who is irresponsibly idle, neglectful, or self-absorbed during a crisis. The image it conjures is of the tyrannical Roman Emperor Nero, callously playing his instrument and perhaps even composing poetry as the great city of Rome was consumed by a devastating fire in 64 AD. This dramatic portrayal, however, is a blend of misinformation and later propaganda. Let's break down the facts. Firstly, the fiddle, as we know it, did not exist in 1st century Rome. If Nero played any instrument during the fire, it would more likely have been the lyre, a stringed instrument common at the time. Nero was known to be a patron of the arts and considered himself a talented musician and poet, often performing publicly, which some traditional Roman elite found scandalous for an emperor. Secondly, and more importantly, according to the most reliable historical accounts, Nero wasn't even in Rome when the Great Fire broke out on July 19, 64 AD. He was at his villa in Antium, a coastal resort about 35 miles south of Rome. When he received news of the fire, the historian Tacitus, who was a child at the time of the fire but later wrote a detailed account in his annals, states that Nero rushed back to Rome. Far from being indifferent, Tacitus reports that Nero organized relief efforts. He opened his private gardens and public buildings like the Baths of Agrippa, and even his own palaces to house the homeless and displaced. He also arranged for food supplies to be brought in from neighboring towns and sold at reduced prices to help the suffering population. He implemented a new urban development plan for rebuilding the city with wider streets and brick buildings to make it less susceptible to future fires. So why the enduring myth of a heartless, fiddling Nero? The rumors that he had somehow benefited from the fire, or even started it himself to clear land for his extravagant new palace, the Domus Aurea, Golden House, began to circulate among the populace even at the time. Nero needed a scapegoat, and he notoriously blamed the Christians, a relatively new and mistrusted religious sect in Rome, initiating the first major Roman persecution against them. Later historians, particularly those writing after Nero's reign and often hostile to him, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, whose accounts are more sensationalized than Tacitus's, heavily promoted the image of Nero as a cruel and depraved tyrant. The story of him singing about the sack of Troy while watching Rome burn, as mentioned by Suetonius and Cassius Dio, fit perfectly with this narrative of monstrous indifference. While Nero's reign was indeed marked by tyranny and brutality, particularly in his later years, the specific image of him fiddling while Rome burned is a powerful piece of historical character assassination rather than a factual account of his actions during the crisis. Number 1. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." Let them eat cake. This is perhaps one of the most infamous quotes attributed to a historical figure. The story goes that when Queen Marie Antoinette of France was told that her peasant subjects had no bread to eat, she callously and dismissively replied, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche, let them eat brioche." Brioche being a rich, eggy bread, more luxurious than simple cake. This phrase has come to symbolize the obliviousness and heartless decadence of the French aristocracy in the face of widespread poverty and suffering, encapsulating the perceived arrogance that fueled the French Revolution. However, there is absolutely no credible historical evidence that Marie Antoinette ever uttered these words. In fact, the phrase, or very similar sentiments, had been circulating in Europe for decades before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France or became queen. Variations of the "let them eat expensive bread pastry" anecdote had been attributed to other royal figures long before her. For example, the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in his autobiographical Confessions, written around 1765 to 1767, when Marie Antoinette was still a child in Austria, and published posthumously, recounts a story where a great princess is said to have uttered these words when told the peasants had no bread. Rousseau does not name the princess, and it certainly couldn't have been Marie Antoinette at that time. The quote was likely a piece of anti-aristocratic folklore, a way to highlight the perceived disconnect between the ruling class and the common people. By the time of the French Revolution, which began in 1789, Marie Antoinette had become a deeply unpopular figure. She was an Austrian princess in a French court, often viewed with suspicion and subjected to vicious propaganda that portrayed her as extravagant, immoral, and indifferent to the suffering of the French people. Pamphleteers and revolutionary propagandists eagerly used any means to discredit the monarchy, and attributing this cold-hearted quote to her was an effective way to fuel public anger and resentment. Marie Antoinette, while certainly accustomed to a life of luxury, was also known for her charitable acts, and letters written by her show concern for the plight of the poor. It is highly improbable that she would have said something so politically damaging and demonstrably out of touch, even if she was sheltered from the worst realities of poverty. The "let them eat cake" story was a powerful tool of political slander that has stuck to her name for centuries, largely because it so perfectly encapsulated the revolutionaries' narrative of an uncaring monarchy. It's a classic case of a memorable and damning quote becoming more famous than the historical truth.